Transformation and how it pertains to the people, bosses, and enemies of Bloodborne remains one of the game's most misunderstood concepts. But thanks to several items, carol runes, key pieces of dialogue, and a close inspection of some real-life literary source material, we have everything we need to understand what's happening in Yharnam. As we established in the previous video, the healing blood is meant to represent the highly intoxicating and addictive anesthetics of the Victorian era, specifically ether and chloroform. When we combine that vital piece of information with the evidence we find in the game relating to beastly transformation, we'll see that the beastly scourge of Yharnam is in fact a plague of addiction. By all accounts, the Scourge of Beasts has swept through Yharnam despite the best efforts to eradicate it. The hunting of beasts hasn't stopped the Scourge. Quarantining people hasn't stopped it. Burning part of the city to the ground hasn't stopped it. It just keeps popping up. We learn from the Charred Hunter set that the Scourge seems to have first emerged in Old Yharnam. Once the streets of Old Yharnam were overrun with beasts, the Hunters of the Healing Church were left with little choice but to set the old district aflame. But the Scourge persisted, spreading into central Yharnam, which is now overrun with Scourge beasts and huntsmen in various stages of transformation. The church has closed the bridge to Cathedral Ward, hoping to stop the spread of the Scourge. But that too has failed. Beasts have overtaken the buildings of even Upper Cathedral Ward. Something about this plague is different. It's not just transmitting from person to person like a disease. Everyone is changing. Even the most devout followers of the church who have sealed themselves away from the masses. So what the heck is going on here? A bit of basic observation leads us to believe that the beastly scourge is caused by the healing blood. As we can conclude with just a little wandering through the city, there are two things we quickly associate with Yharnam. One, it's crawling with beasts, and two, it's overflowing with the healing blood. But there are several items in Bloodborne that help us to solidify this connection. The description of the blood vial tells us that most Yharnamites are heavy users of blood. Most Yharnamites are either dead or beasts, so it's safe to say the blood is somehow associated with this. This correlation between blood use and beasthood is much more strongly reinforced by the Reiterpalush trick weapon. According to its description, the old nobles, longtime imbibers of blood, are no strangers to the sanguine plague. Here we have a sanguine or blood plague that's associated with the emergence and disposal of beasts. But much more importantly, the item indicates in no uncertain terms that this beastly plague is related to the long-term or excessive imbibing of blood. We can also look to the Ailing Laran root chalice. Its description states, there are trace remains of medical procedures in parts of Ailing Laran. Whether these were attempts to control the scourge of the beast or the cause of the outbreak is unknown. In Japanese, the word treatment or care is used instead of procedure. This tells us that the common medical treatment of Laran might have caused the scourge rather than controlled it. The implication in both the Reiterpalush and the Ailing Laran root chalice is that it's the blood, an intoxicating substance that's used as a medicinal treatment, that's responsible for the scourge. Our natural instinct as players and lore hunters is to immediately think, okay, there's something mystical or cosmic about this blood that's causing ordinary men and women to transform into beasts. But there's really no evidence on the back end to support that idea. It's not that mysterious or that complicated. From Software is doing what writers have done for thousands of years. They're just using a metaphor here. To wrap our heads around this, it's helpful to look at what Bloodborne game director Hidetaka Miyazaki said about it in his 2015 interview with Future Press. The urge to transform into a beast is in conflict with the basic sense of humanity we all have. That humanity serves as a kind of shackle, keeping the transformation in its place. The stronger the shackle, keeping the urge to transform in place is, the larger the recoil once that shackle is finally broken. The results cause you to transform into a larger creature or a more twisted one. There are a couple of things to unpack here. First, Miyazaki's telling us that transformation is ultimately the loss of one's basic sense of humanity. This is absolutely critical. It's the loss of one's sense of humanity that causes the transformation. Second, Miyazaki's saying that people with the strongest will, meaning the greatest ability to retain their sense of humanity for as long as possible, become the biggest, most deformed creatures. Think Emilia and the blood-starved beast and the cleric beast. So what causes a person to lose their humanity? Although there are several ways we see this play out in the game, in this video we'll focus on the main cause. It's addiction. This is the type of transformation we observe in all beast-like creatures. As we noted earlier, we're given a smattering of clues throughout the game telling us that the beastly scourge is somehow linked to the healing blood. The strong implication is that the people of Yharnam, even the most strong-willed people of all, like Lawrence and Emilia, can't resist the temptation of the intoxicating healing blood. They become hooked on the blood, and their humanity is lost. The shackle is broken. The transformation into another creature ensues. The item that's most helpful to understanding beastly transformation is the clawmark rune. This rune is dropped by Gilbert following his beastly transformation, and by the NPC enemy in the Hunter's Nightmare who wields the beast claw. The clawmark rune description states, "The clawmark is an impulse to seek the warmth of blood like a beast. Although the difference is subtle, runesmith Carroll describes the beast as a horrific and unwelcome instinct deep within the hearts of men, while clawmark is an alluring invitation to accept this very nature." What does this mean? The clawmark rune makes clear that all men have an inner beastly instinct, or beast, that's constrained or subdued. That's exactly what Miyazaki was saying in his Drained of Blood interview. If a person accepts this alluring invitation, the beast takes over and one's humanity is lost. As we've discussed in this series, the short story The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Victorian author Robert Louis Stevenson helped to shape the mythos of the healing blood. And not surprisingly, the story is also at the core of the beastly scourge. At the conclusion of Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson provides Jekyll's written testimony. It's essentially a searing self-critique in which the doctor discloses an ongoing battle within himself. As a result of this inner conflict, Jekyll concludes that there is a thorough and primitive duality of man, or what he calls a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. Man, in Jekyll's telling, is a moral and intellectual creature in constant conflict with a desire to partake in forbidden pleasures. Jekyll's a doctor and chemist whose life work has been the creation of healing substances, much like Lawrence. But as his work progressed, concocting new medicinal treatments, he began using certain agents I found to have the power to shake and pluck back that fleshly vestment, even as a wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion. More simply stated, he discovered compounds that caused such a powerful high that it shed his fleshly vestment, meaning his humanity. Jekyll eventually confesses that as he consumed greater amounts of this concoction, he could no longer control the transformation into Hyde. All things therefore seemed to point to this, Jekyll writes, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. Jekyll was losing his fight with addiction. He explicitly describes his evil alter ego as a beast, referring to Hyde as the animal within me licking the chops of memory, one that had been chained down but began to growl for license. In essence, Jekyll's addictive serum was the clawmark. Mr. Hyde was the beast. The clawmark rune is dropped by Gilbert, a character that, as we discussed in the last video, is meant to represent Gilbert Abbott, the first man to undergo surgery under the effects of ether. This inspiration only reinforces our understanding of clawmark and beast. Clawmark refers to the ability of intoxicants, such as ether or the healing blood, to make someone into a beast. Ether, just like the healing blood, is a highly intoxicating, highly addictive drug. By getting that first taste of ether's powerful effects, man may then succumb to the alluring invitation, or in Japanese, the inescapable temptation of ether or the healing blood, or really any addictive intoxicant. These intoxicants are the claw mark, or the temptation, whereas the beast is one's inner beastliness that is unleashed by succumbing to addiction. With addiction, a man loses his humanity and his self-control. He'll give up anything and everything for more of the addictive substance or activity. This is exactly what we see in Bloodborne with the healing blood, which is just like ether. The healing blood is highly intoxicating, highly addictive, and as men abuse it, they lose their humanity and transform into beasts. The situation in Old Yharnam helps us to see how addiction to the healing blood is the scourge. As we learn from the antidote item, Ashen blood was a baffling sickness that ravaged Old Yharnam long ago. Based on what we know of the Victorian era and its real-life plagues, there's reason to suspect that Ashen blood was inspired by cholera. In 1832 and again in 1840, catastrophic outbreaks of cholera ravaged the district of Edinburgh known as Old Town. That's undoubtedly where Old Yharnam, which is referred to in Japanese as simply the Old Town District, gets its name. Although Edinburgh's Old Town wasn't sealed off and burned, the area was slowly abandoned in favor of New Town in the wake of epidemics in the early to mid-1800s. Cholera is a waterborne disease that causes severe dehydration through intense diarrhea. Dehydration occurs so quickly and dramatically with cholera that the blood literally thickens. That's likely where the name Ashen blood comes from. It's blood that has been dried out or dehydrated such that we could figuratively consider it dry as ash. Cholera was also nicknamed the Blue Terror because victims' skin often would turn dark blue, which is why the beast patients that we find in Old Yharnam have dark bluish-black fur, and females excrete a dark bluish-black or purplish-black substance. As we learn from their item description, antidotes were used to treat Ashen blood, which, quote, triggered the spread of the beastly scourge. But how could Ashen blood have triggered the beastly scourge? It's simple. It wasn't the Ashen blood that caused the transformation. It was addiction to the healing blood that did that. After the Ashen blood sickness took over Old Yharnam, the healing church stepped in with its powerful treatment, the healing blood. It put the old Yharnamites into a state of euphoria, craving more of the substance. The healing blood didn't necessarily cure the Ashen blood illness, it just created a new problem. If we look again at cholera, likely the inspiration for Ashen blood, we can find a good example of this playing out in real life. Before medications and even basic remedies like saline solution were available to combat the disease and its most potent symptom, diarrhea, the common treatment for cholera was opium, which possesses natural anti-diarrheal properties. In the West, that meant using opium tinctures like laudanum, or even heating small doses of opium to produce an intoxicating vapor. These doses were referred to as opium pills. This could be what the antidotes represent. Or the antidotes could represent something benign like salicin, a precursor to aspirin, discovered by Scottish physician Thomas John MacLagan in the mid-1800s. MacLagan used salicin as a fever reducer for cholera and typhus. But just like the antidotes only provided short-term relief from Ashen blood, salicin or even opium and poppy-based medicines couldn't cure cholera. They just temporarily alleviated discomfort. In Old Yharnam, people sick with Ashen blood took the antidote pills to temporarily relieve discomfort, but it wasn't a cure. So they turned to the healing blood. But it didn't work either. It just hooked the Old Yharnamites on a powerful, intoxicating, and highly addictive substance. It was the addiction that cost them their humanity. It was the addiction that transformed them into beasts. In Old Yharnam, Residents specifically became beast patients because they were already sick with ashen blood. We know that the Scourge of Beasts isn't a traditional disease, thanks to several items we can acquire. The old hunters would tightly tie the old hunter armbands to prevent infection by the Scourge, but as the item description states, of course, the idea that the Scourge was infectious was pure hearsay. That's why adorning the old hunter gloves with brass or tying tourniquet-like belts on the old hunter trousers were useless superstitions. Addiction isn't infectious or contagious. It comes from within. It's the same reason why the Scourge has persisted despite the endless hunting, the burning of old Yharnam, and the retreating to higher and higher areas within Yharnam. It's not contagious. It comes from within. Drug abuse and addiction are themes that permeate the game. They're at the center of the Healing Church, as we hear directly from the mouth of its leading cleric, Vicar Amelia. If the player approaches her in the Grand Cathedral but remains far enough away to avoid triggering the fight, we find her kneeling and repeating a mantra-like prayer at the altar. "Beware the frailty of men," she says. "Their wills are weak, minds young. The foul beasts will dangle nectar and lure the meek into the depths. Remain wary of the frailty of men." The words of this prayer underscore the entirety of the Scourge of Beasts. Men innately are weak-willed and will follow nectar, meaning intoxicating, tempting substances, into the depths. This is what the opening cutscene of the game is trying to tell us, that through addiction, we'll follow foul beasts into the depths. In the introductory cutscene, we're administered the healing blood, an intoxicating and addictive substance that causes us to drift off into a dreamlike state. In this haze, a Scourge beast emerges from a pool of blood on the floor, reaching out its claw to beckon us to the depths from whence it emerged. It wants us to drown in the addictive blood. It reaches out its claw because it's trying to get its claws into us. This is the claw mark. We're able to resist its temptation for now, but can we resist the pull of the healing blood forever? Lawrence, the first vicar and founder of the Healing Church, could not. We see a visual depiction of this very thing within the item called Lawrence's skull. Lawrence's human skull, lost long ago, is shown sinking into a pool of blood ringed by his church shawl. All of this conveys the same message. The blood is the substance that we're supposed to fear, the substance that makes us drunk, the substance that, as Master Willem warned, is the undoing of men. It's the substance that causes us to lose our humanity and succumb to our inner beastliness. The Scourge is addiction. There's a second way to understand Clawmark and Beast, even though addiction remains at their core. Whereas the beastly Scourge most commonly is connected with the everyday use and abuse of the healing blood, and thus addiction, blood drunkenness, or what I'll call bloodlust, is caused not by consumption of the healing blood, but instead by brutality. We see this exemplified in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and in several items and pieces of dialogue in the game. In Jekyll and Hyde, the evil Mr. Hyde is responsible for a savage murder and goes on the lam. In Jekyll's final testimony, he writes, "Hyde, in danger of his life, was a creature new to me, shaken with inordinate anger, strung to the pitch of murder, lusting to inflict pain." Jekyll's inner beast was brought about by abuse of a drug, but the inner beast was sustained by this violence, this bloodlust. Of all the items in Bloodborne that help us see the role of bloodlust and transformation, the most important is the Eye of a Blood-Drunk Hunter. This item, which we have to obtain in order to access the Hunter's Nightmare, is a pupil that is collapsed and turned to mush, indicating the onset of the Scourge of Beasts. This indicates in no uncertain terms that blood drunkenness is associated with the onset of the Scourge of Beasts. But the old hunters that we find in the Hunter's Nightmare, those who are afflicted with blood drunkenness, aren't worshipping at the altar of Lawrence or indulgently gulping down the healing blood. They're in some sort of eternal purgatory, mercilessly slaughtering beast patients, seemingly innocent creatures who are trembling with fear. Hunters who go blood drunk aren't drunk in the sense of consuming an addictive substance, such as the healing blood. They're addicted to the hunt, the drawing of blood from beasts. They're in the ravages of bloodlust. It's just like Jura tells us if we continue to slaughter the beasts of old Yharnam. It's you're the beast. Just think about what you're doing. It's utter madness. Eileen the Crow is even more explicit when she tells us, few hunters can resist the intoxication of the hunt. Look at you sorry drunk. I'll string you up like the filthy beast you are. Aside from the old hunters of the nightmare, Father Gascoigne serves as the best illustration of this bloodlust. As Eileen tells us, Gascoigne is falling apart. He's been driven mad by the hunt, chopping up bodies like a frantic anatomist, such that by the time we find him in the Tomb of Eden, he's already started to lose his humanity and is showing outward signs of beastliness. He turns to us and flashes his fangs. The item description for Gascoigne's gloves and trousers reinforce this idea, stating that these garments are tainted by the pungent beastly stench that eats away at Gascoigne. The smell of beasts, the former humans that he's carved up by the hundreds, is eating away at his humanity. This violent bloodlust has rendered him unable to distinguish friend from foe. Like a violent drunk of the Victorian era, Gascoigne has abandoned his children and beaten his wife to death, having been driven mad by his lust for beast blood. When we encounter Gascoigne in the Tomb of Eden, it's important to recognize that he's not in the process of killing a live beast. He's mutilating a beast corpse. The kill is no longer enough. His thirst for beast blood requires him to first decapitate the beast, then bury his axe in the chest of the beast, causing blood to spray all over his face and cloak. As I'll explain in much greater depth in the next video, Bloodborne's hunters are meant to represent the surgeons and anatomists of the Victorian era. Gascoigne, who loses his humanity to bloodlust, is supposed to represent a mindless surgeon who amputates limbs without hesitation, or a ruthless anatomist who dissects cadavers for medical research. Gascoigne, like other blood-drunk hunters, is meant to represent the heartless medical practitioner who has lost his humanity to brutality. He views the patient or the cadaver on the table as no longer human, just a lifeless slab of meat with no more dignity or individuality than a rotting deer carcass. In this regard, the claw mark rune can be seen as the alluring invitation for the incising anatomist or surgeon to seek the warmth of blood. The brutal desire to slice open bodies causes these physicians to lose their humanity, just as we see with Gascoigne. The symbol of the claw mark rune, a surgical incision that has been stitched up, makes even more sense now. This revelation that hunters' bloodlust or brutality is what turns them into beasts allows us to understand the third and final meaning of beastliness in Bloodborne. If hunters are the surgeons and anatomists of the Victorian era, and the hunter's job is to hack and slice their way through beasts, then beasts also can be understood to mean surgical patients and cadavers. The beast patients in Old Yharnam and the hunter's nightmare help to solidify this conclusion. Gascoigne, bearing the attire and weapons of early hunters, is meant to represent primitive surgery or dissection. As I said, we'll cover this in much greater depth in coming videos. Now that we understand the true nature of the healing blood and the beastly scourge, we're able to unlock door after door in the Bloodborne universe. In the next video, we'll start to examine how the life of William Ernest Henley and his surgery at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh gave rise to every institution in Bloodborne, from the Healing Church to the College of Byrgenwerth and the School of Mensis. We'll focus first on Byrgenwerth and the betrayal. As we move forward from there, I'll explain the origins of major figures in the game, including Master Willem, Lawrence, and Ludwig. It'll be fascinating to peel back these layers of the lore.